Welcome to the webinar. This is a webinar in the Financial Abuse Awareness series. My name is Bill Mitchell. This series is part of the Financial Protections Project, co-designed by the Queensland Government, Caxton Legal Centre and Townsville Community Law. The series is an online continuing professional development program that aims to raise financial industry awareness about the financial abuse of older persons. Before we begin, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This presentation is about how professionals respond to financial abuse, and that's the last in the series. The slides are not read verbatim but paraphrased for emphasis. They are designed to be standalone, readable modules and contain references for deeper learning. So let's begin. Before we begin, let's pause and look at this statement from AFCA Determination 472675. It says the relationship between an FSP and its customer is based on contract. The FSP must act on the instructions of its customer unless something is known about the transaction which would cause a reasonable banker to question those instructions. Examples of this include where it appears the customer is or might be a victim of elder abuse. We've already talked about the general responses to financial abuse, and now we turn to the specific responses of financial industry professionals, or advisors as we call them in this series. Advisors have the knowledge to identify financial abuse and the skills to deal with older persons at risk of abuse. They know the impacts of abuse and what happens if they don't stop being part of the problem and instead become part of the solution. In this final module, we look at some specific actions that advisors can take to be part of the solution. In the right-hand side of the box, you can see the learning outcomes for participants in this module. Using the knowledge and skills from this program, advisors should understand ethical rules and standards that apply to their own professional setting. They should see older persons within a positive context and encourage positive ageing. They should understand the context, form and types of financial abuse, should understand how financial abuse coalesces around key decision-making areas, should be prepared to assess relevant risks and vulnerabilities, and consider the existence or risk of financial abuse in older persons. Should take a client-centred approach and adapt to the needs of each older person, including those within specific groups, work with capacity issues if necessary, and always respond in accordance with obligations such as legal, ethical, regulatory and industry practice obligations. Be proactive in assisting and referring older persons, and from an organisational perspective, develop policies and practice to ensure systemic responses to financial abuse. The CPA lists this industry example, and these are some of the ethical considerations that arise for cases of financial abuse. Take your time to read them. You can see that these ethical considerations include some aspects that are about not being part of the problem, that is, not perpetrating or helping to facilitate financial abuse yourself as an advisor, and others are more about taking a proactive stance. When any of the following issues are present, we suggest a cautious approach should be taken. That includes indicators or evidence of cognitive impairment or impaired decision-making capacity. Remember, this is not an opportunity to say the person has no legal capacity. This is an opportunity to look at how you maximise their capacity and what supports they might need. Look for signs of lost or diminished autonomy from a more broader perspective. Look at the presence of a third party or persons of trust or influence and think about their motives or the impact of family influence, which might be an undue influence in that situation. Look for negative relationships within close social networks. Look at the indicators of life course issues, things like have they been a victim of other forms of interpersonal violence? Are they care leavers? Are they suffering from financial stress or exclusion? Think about particular community issues for members of particular vulnerable groups. Think about risk factors, vulnerabilities or behavioural triggers, and of course, industry red flags. There are some industry examples, and this one is from APES 110 and sets out the sorts of threats that accountants face to their own values and ethics. Importantly, financial abuse could potentially fit into any of the list of threats, including self-interest threat, self-review threat, or an advocacy threat, or even familiarity or intimidation threats. Where threats are encountered, accountants are expected to use safeguards, and safeguards are actions or other measures that eliminate threats or reduce them to an acceptable level. Financial abuse is no different and should be treated within the context of this policy. Taking a cautious approach includes avoiding conflicts of interest, knowing who your client is and what their needs are, being able to maximise capacity and support autonomy and independence, ensure no undue influence, coercion or duress, make sure you're able to address their particular needs from a client-centred approach, seek guidance wherever necessary, and be able to provide independent and comprehensive advice so they can fully appreciate the nature of the transaction and can then make an informed decision. Here's an industry example that arises out of the Royal Commission into Misconduct into the banking, superannuation and financial services industry. It talks about the nature of conflicts of interest within financial advice services. Take a moment to read that quote. All advisors have the obligation and opportunity to seek guidance on ethical and standards issues. Here's examples from the accounting profession and from the financial counselling. Very important to note that all advisors have an obligation to seek guidance from a more senior or more specialised advisor in the instance that they're concerned about a particular situation and might need some guidance on either an ethical or a process issue. If you're an advisor and you discover that abuse is happening, there's a fairly standard approach that's accepted amongst all elder abuse and financial abuse response plans. Firstly, you need to identify whether abuse is taking place. Secondly, provide any necessary supports, including decision-making supports. Number 3, assess the risks and make a safety plan. Number 4, make appropriate referrals. And number 5, keep relevant records. There are some reminders we want to leave you with from good industry practice. Advisors have training to identify the red flags. Advisors also have a duty to inquire and identify financial abuse. These may need to take positive steps to make your inquiry, and this can lead to delay. Positive steps may also include a duty to warn or a duty to protect. And positive steps may, in rare occasions, include breaching confidence or even contacting third parties. All of these are reinforced by industry ethics. For example, if you look at APES 110 140.7, which sets out permitted disclosures to confidentiality. The CPA recognises that its members can and should respond in all cases. They talk about there before the abuse occurs, such as providing advice on retirement planning, or after the abuse commences, when advising a client on the state of their financial situations. Accountants can potentially come across abusive situations across the whole continuum of financial abuse, while a person is at risk of or even experiencing abuse. The CPA has a checklist called Planning Ahead, a checklist for preventing the financial abuse of older persons. This checklist can be used in conjunction with practical advice about implementing an organisational policy, responding when employees raise concerns, investigating concerns, and showing leadership. This is just one industry example of responding to financial abuse. It's important to implement a financial abuse policy, or possibly a broader elder abuse policy within which that financial abuse policy sits. The Victorian water sector policy approach I've used here it's an example of how broadly these policies are now finding themselves throughout industry. And you can see there's some brief details there about the policy approach. Take some time to read those bullet points. We're starting to see some policy approaches across a wide range of services. The Australian Banking Association uses industry guidelines on responding to requests from a power of attorney or a court-appointed administrator. Some of these arrangements are currently in review, and as they are updated, you should make sure you keep current with the most recent version of industry advice. Before we leave this final module, let's think about working effectively with older persons and the skills we need to do that. Think about in your workplace, has there been discussions about financial abuse? And if there have been, have those discussions considered how you and your colleagues should respond? In your industry, have advisors been taking a cautious approach to cases that might involve abuse? And does your workplace have a policy on elder abuse or financial abuse? And does it reflect the sorts of issues you've seen in this training program? Thanks for listening to this webinar series. Feel free to download the PDF file for future reference. The next module will be recapping. Thanks for listening.